This maps the Judean hierarchy of power. At the peak, the Roman Empire demanded total submission. Just below, the religious elite applied constant downward pressure. The base was the poor, burdened by taxes. Lowest were the outcasts, violently segregated and removed from the structure entirely. This entire system was fueled by the law of retaliation, the basic human drive to strike back against those who cause harm. In this world, power was measured by the authority to conquer, to tax, or to cast someone out. After an impressive appearance at the temple when he was 12, the historical record for Jesus of Nazareth goes silent for 18 years. He spent those missing years in Nazareth, living as a carpenter, lifting heavy timber and feeling the weight of a hammer day after day. He lived the human condition alongside the laborers of Galilee, experiencing the quiet desperation of a people struggling under the weight of Roman neglect. When he finally emerged from his silence at age 30, he brought with him a perspective that challenged the structural logic of the ancient world. Lepers were the living ghosts of the first century. They were legally required to shout unclean, to warn the healthy to stay away. Jesus disrupted this segregation when he walked directly toward a leper and touched the man's skin with his own calloused hand. This physical contact was an intentional act that ended the isolation of the outcast. By treating the untouchable as a brother, he began to dismantle the hierarchy from the bottom up. On the hillsides, he taught the crowds a new mandate: love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. In a society built on the law of retaliation, this was a political act. The Roman Empire relied on fear and the threat of violence to maintain its authority over the masses. This diagram illustrates how his teaching functioned. By convincing a population to replace hatred with love, he created an expanding network that neutralized the empire's primary weapon of control. The authorities realized that a people who cannot be made to hate or fear can no longer be governed by the traditional tools of the state. As the tension peaked in Jerusalem, political traps closed in, and one of his own companions agreed to betray him for 30 pieces of silver. Even during their final meal, his students were debating which of them held the highest rank, still operating under the logic of the Roman hierarchy. Jesus answered them by taking the position of the lowest servant. He poured water into a basin and washed the dirt-caked feet of his followers, including the man who was about to betray him. This demonstrated his definition of leadership. The person at the top of the hierarchy exists to serve those at the bottom. After his arrest and a mock trial, he was marched to the hill of Golgotha. The empire used the cross as the ultimate display of top-down power to crush those who threatened the social order. Nails were driven through his hands, hands that shaped wood in Nazareth and touched the diseased in Galilee. Facing the agony of execution, he refused to call down curses on his accusers. Instead, he spoke a final request: "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." When the empire attempted to prove its total dominance, he set a new limit for human forgiveness. Days later, the stone was found rolled away from the tomb. The empty tomb signaled that the empire's ultimate weapon of death had completely failed to end the movement he started. He had inverted the hierarchy. Power was no longer a tool for those at the top to crush those below, but a means for the few to support the many through service and grace.
This was the structure of the first-century world. The Roman Empire maintained absolute dominance through fear, supported by religious elites enforcing a strict hierarchy. In this system, power only flowed downward. The vast majority lived at the base, crushed under Roman taxes and societal neglect. Yet the most influential figure of this era is missing from the record during his most formative years. After appearing as a 12-year-old prodigy in the Jerusalem temple, he vanishes for nearly 2 decades. To challenge a world built on top-down dominance, a new kind of power had to be cultivated, where elites never looked: the quiet, deliberate obscurity of the common worker, far from the centers of influence. He spent those 18 years in Nazareth, a town so small it was effectively invisible to the empire. To his neighbors, he wasn't a scholar or a prince. He was simply the carpenter's son. His life was defined by the physical toll of manual labor. He spent his days lifting heavy timber and shaping wood, with hands that grew thick with calluses, sweating under the same sun as the poorest laborers in Galilee. He didn't learn about the struggle of the working class from ancient scrolls. He saw the quiet desperation of his neighbors and the daily reality of Roman occupation from the workbench. When he finally emerged at age 30, he brought a perspective forged by the very people the empire considered disposable. He was ready to meet that rigid social order with a logic it wasn't prepared to handle. That social order relied on strict rules of separation. People with diseases like leprosy were treated as living ghosts, cast out of their communities and forced to shout "unclean" to keep others at a distance. Jesus ignored those rules entirely. Instead of maintaining his distance, he walked directly toward a man the rest of society was conditioned to avoid. He reached out with those calloused carpenter's hands and directly touched the man's broken skin, choosing physical proximity over the safety of the law. This wasn't just an act of healing, it was a political statement. It proved that isolation only has power if people agree to stay apart. By crossing that line, he showed that no human being is inherently untouchable. Roman authority was built on the law of retaliation. Power was preserved by ensuring that any harm to the state or the social order was met with an equal or greater punishment. This cycle of hatred kept the population in check. But on the hillsides of Galilee, he introduced a command that broke the loop. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. This was a direct threat to the ruling class. If you teach people to meet violence with love, the primary tool of the oppressor, fear, becomes useless. The Roman system relied on the instinct to strike back. A populace that chooses to conquer hatred with love is a populace that an empire can no longer control. The tension reached its peak in Jerusalem. As the authorities looked for a way to arrest him, one of his own companions traded his loyalty for 30 pieces of silver. Even at their final meal together, his followers were still thinking in terms of the old hierarchy, arguing over which of them would be the greatest in his kingdom. To answer them, he didn't use words. He stood up, tied a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin. He knelt on the dusty floor and performed the job of the lowest servant, washing the dirt from his students' feet, including the man who was currently betraying him. With this act, he redefined the very nature of authority. He showed that true greatness isn't found in how many people you control, but in how many people you serve. The end came quickly. In the flash of Roman torches, he was arrested in Gethsemane, abandoned by his friends, and subjected to a mockery of a trial. He was marched to the hill of Golgotha. This was the empire's final answer. The cross was the most brutal tool Rome had to demonstrate its total dominance over the individual. Iron nails were driven through the same hands that had shaped wood in Nazareth and touched the outcasts in Galilee. This was the ultimate test of his teaching. The question was whether a message of love and grace could actually survive the maximum force of state-sanctioned violence. Even in the agony of the cross, surrounded by a mocking crowd, he refused to return to the cycle of retaliation. He did not call down curses on the soldiers below him. Instead, he offered a final act of grace, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Days later, the stone was rolled away, leaving an empty tomb. That empty tomb is the historical evidence that the forces of the world, hatred, fear, and systemic oppression, are ultimately powerless to bury the revolutionary impact of humility and grace.